Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to the King's Crypt. Thank you for joining me for part 3 and the final episode for the time being of a PSA from my town by East-Criticism-7844 of r/nosleep and of Reddit. If you've enjoyed these installments, please make sure to check out this fantastic storyteller on r/nosleep, as well as his own personal page on Reddit. Now, let's begin part 3. The story of my small town. Man, it's been hot out these last few days. A couple people mentioned being curious about my day-to-day, and honestly, I wouldn't consider myself the hero of the story or anything. And other than the PSAs, my life is probably pretty boring. I get up with enough time to make my coffee and head off to eat my egg sandwich before daybreak. My day-to-day varies by the season. In the summer, I'm mostly concerned with getting my hay cut and baled in a timely manner, and in the winter, I'm out in the field birthing calves in the only mud hole on the property. Those heifers tend to choose the worst spot possible to go into labor. Truthfully, the odd broadcasts are the only exciting part of my day. I've mentioned the 3-headed squirrels a couple of times. Now listen, I know that squirrels do not have 3 heads normally. So let me tell you the story that I've cobbled together from residents of this town. And God, it's a long one. Back in the early 1800s, about 50 or so miles away, a rural farming town began to develop. Mainly, it was coveted for the large amount of mostly flat land that was unbroken by trees and sections of forest. The soil was soft and workable, but did not have the issues of being mixed with sand or large veins of clay and rock. The only problem was water. The rain was enough to keep the crops alive, but the townspeople began to struggle to collect enough clean water for bathing and drinking. The closest source was a dark water lake a couple miles away from the cluster of homesteads. The established leaders of this town were very weary of a small body of water due to its dark, tea-like color. Many of the women tried convincing them that there was nothing to worry about, that dead leaves and grass were the only oddity to blame for the strange black hue of the lake. Despite this, the men of the town prohibited any residents from traveling to the lake to collect water, and instead had ordered the women and older children to travel into the forest to gather buckets of clear water from the creek. Soon, the women took issue with the fact that these creeks took hours to walk to, and frequently brought up the poor conditions of their children's feet by the end of the trip. They argued the lake would be a much more manageable journey, that they could visit multiple times a day and have more time for chores that they'd been completing in the dark due to the late hours that they would be returning home from the creeks. After many weeks of this, they had finally been permitted to travel to the lake for water as long as it was thoroughly boiled before being drunk or bathed in. After that detail, most of the old farmers around here just recite the same old, and shit just started getting weird. So they moved out of here. All my life, I was just fine with that story. I never really cared about this town's history, and most of the times we talked about it, it would end up with chuckles and those crazy folks that believed in witches and monsters. But without fail, whenever that point was brought up, we grew quiet with the unspoken elephant in the room. Now, I kind of figured I'm a pretty quiet and apathetic man. Most days, while I sit and have my egg sandwich, I catch a sentence or two from Mr. Larson or Mr. Tiller poking fun at me for being so stoic. It never bothered me much, and we'd usually share a short laugh about it. My point is, I never seen the need to go digging into anything that ain't soil. But after seeing a few comments last week from people who were curious about my little town, it sparked my own curiosity. So yesterday, I headed up north to the closest library, hoping I could find some more context. I didn't find much, but I did stumble across a couple photocopied journal entries, and I'll try and scribe what was legible through the dark stains on the papers. Entries from Constance Whitaker, May 21st, 1812. We settled into this patch of untouched land 9 days ago, and tensions already seem high. The children are very tired from the journey, and the men keep mentioning that once they pass about a mile west of camp, the air gets chilly and thin, and they feel as if they're being watched from the tree line. I traveled out there with Mrs. Weller, and we didn't seem to feel the same conflict they speak of. After a while, we came upon an odd sight. A stark, black pond set just between the tree line. I commented on the hue to Mrs. Weller, and she speculated that the leaves from the trees just a few feet away must have fallen into the water, steeping and turning it dark brown like tea. We spoke about how we worried for the men as we walked back. The stress of picking up and moving into a new land must be plain awful. We were heavily scolded as we entered back into camp. The sky was suddenly much darker as we neared the small tents, and the worried and angry faces of men went on and on about how we'd been gone all day on our little walk, while the children sat unattended. As I write this, my husband has already gone to bed, and our tent is quiet. I can almost hear whispers traveling in the wind. I can only assume that some of the boys are sat out by the fire. Speaking in hushed tones is not to wake up the whole camp. Either way, I feel a chill coming on, and I think it may be time to head to bed. Entry number 2. May 25th, 1812. Mrs. Weller and I brought up the lake on more than one occasion, as the men discussed the issues of clean drinking water. Upon the discovery of its location, though, we were pointedly told that we must never travel that far west again, and we were told instead to travel a half-day trip into the forest where they scouted a small system of creeks. We protested, as the lake is very close and seems to be an abundant source of water. They seemed to just look between each other for a moment before once again prohibiting anybody from traveling beyond the established crop fields in that direction. Entry number 3. June 16th, 1816. Much has happened during this time, and I fear this may be my last entry that I write. To whomever finds these notes, I apologize for the rushed scrawls as my last half candle is burning quickly, and my hands are slick with viscera. After my last entry, the men doubled down against our protests for making the trip for water. We'd spent many days going back and forth nearly every day. We fell behind on chores, livestock began to die, and our children complained endlessly about their condition of their sore feet. I spoke with my friend, Mrs. Weller, about my concerns, and she recommended we just go to the lake anyway to boil the water until it's clear. The children could play or rest by the pond as we do, and we could keep it secret from the men. I asked how on earth we could hide the fact that we head west every day, and she said just travel in the direction of the forest until we're far enough away to not be seen off of the lake. It would only add 30 minutes. Think about the children, Constance. Her tone was a little odd at that moment, but I agreed that the trip would be much easier on everybody. We got away with it for nearly 7 days when the issue started. One day as we arrived at the lake, I noticed a concerning fact. The land around the lake had clearly fallen away and sunken into the dark water, widening the opening in the earth. Despite this, the water level was exactly the same, remaining level with the land around it. I'd only noticed it once when a small patch of flowers the children loved to make bracelets and crowns out of had inexplicably fallen into the lake overnight. I tried to brush off the feeling of unease that this gave me, explaining it away with the fact that we'd been romping around the area. Maybe the soil was softer around the water. Oh, gracious Lord, I was so wrong. As the days passed on, the lake grew wider and wider. As we sat by our small fire waiting for the dark water to boil, I noticed the edges of the tree line didn't seem to fall away into the abyss. In fact, it seemed to only be progressing in the direction of the camp. Not too long after I'd noticed this oddity, one of the men came hollering up to us as we sat beside the water. He told us that he could see the wisp of smoke from camp and had brought up his suspicion with the other men in town before he left. As the children played by the tree line, not yet noticing that Mr. Cordell was chastising us, a strange calm overcame me. My vision blurred and swayed, making me feel horribly nauseous. I hardly caught the sight of Mrs. Weller raising the large stick over her head before walloping it upside the head of the man. I felt the warm spray of misted blood against my face, immediately clearing my mind of a strange haze that had befallen me. I smothered a scream behind my clasped hands, not wanting to alert the children to the truly horrific sight only steps away from where they play. Too stunned to speak, I could only watch as Mrs. Weller bent down to where he lay, biting down on his neck and tearing away pieces of flesh until the blood poured freely. Horrid slurping sounds accompanied the wet chewing noises. My God! She ate from him until his neck was nothing but a shriveled nest of tendons and vertebrae. His dead eyes stared at me accusingly as she cupped his clotting blood in her hands and forced me to drink. Clumpy, warm, sticky viscera flowed down my chin and onto my bodice as she scooped more and more into my mouth. I'm so ashamed to admit that after the first couple of handfuls, I quit resisting. I drank gratefully from her hands, nipping at her fingertips. My stomach growled terribly at the taste of meat, and I began to eat from him as well. I paid close attention to the children's playful hollering on the other side of the lake, making sure they hadn't realized what we were doing. I was so hungry. Upon finishing, we rolled his body into the lake, almost instantly disappearing beneath the dark waters. Afterwards, we washed our clothes and faces in the pool, drinking freely as we did. We gathered the children, not bothering to finish purifying the water before heading back. I walked in a daze. Still, I couldn't help but notice that we didn't take our typical route back, instead coming straight from the west, not bothering to hide our path this time. The men were on the other side of the camp, building pens for the livestock that had previously been tied off. They didn't even notice the direction we'd come from. When the men asked where Mr. Corder went, Mrs. Weller hastily told them that we had not seen him, and suggested that if he'd headed in the direction he claimed, then he may have become disoriented and got lost in the thick forest to the west. A search party formed, but subsequently came back in low spirits as they had not found the missing man. From then on, I stayed away from Mrs. Weller, deeply ashamed of what I'd done in her company days prior. I felt severely ill. My fever raged for days. Unrelenting nausea and hunger plagued me as I laid up in my tent alone. Very brief moments of consciousness accompanied the heavy taste of copper and visions of Mrs. Weller spoon-feeding thick viscera into my mouth. I drank and ate greedily, with no second thought as to the source of my substance. Slowly, my strength returned, but the hunger was insatiable. I was never satisfied once my fever had subsided. The ache in my joints came only in full force. I remembered the growing pains I'd felt as a child, but the fifth night of my affliction, I had noticed with no small concern that I could swat the flies away from my knees with total ease. My limbs had inexplicably elongated significantly. My jaw began to hurt, something horrible. And as I felt my face, I found that my jaw seemed larger than it did before. Many nights after I stopped hearing my husband come through the tent flap, smelling of sweat and dirt, I noticed that Mrs. Weller would visit me nightly. She fed me the thick, pungent soup, chanting words I couldn't understand. I thought we'd left the accusations far behind when we left our home. We hadn't favored the dramatics of those town people, mercilessly slaughtering any woman claiming to be a witch. And Mrs. Weller kneeled before me, feeding me human flesh and chanting incomprehensible phrases all the while. I regretted my choice to travel from our old homestead in search of a simpler life. One night, as I sat upon my blankets, feeling the cold, hard ground beneath me, I thought I'd seen the shimmering surface of water. In that moment, I knew that enough of the soil around the lake had fallen away into the dark waters to reach the edge of our camp. So I lay here, gaining strength day by day. My horrid body had grown into a dog-like visage. My uncut fingernails have grown thick and black, as my hair had grown long and matted along my skin. I fear that I will gain the strength to stand upon my own weight soon. healthy enough to satiate my hunger on my own. Please, Lord, forgive me for whatever this awful witch has done to me. As I peer out the door, I see no people outside, only Mrs. Weller, bustling among the firelight. So that's where the journal ends. Of course, I noticed that the woman just a few miles away shares the name of the one in the story. I can't imagine that they'd be the same person. I mean, no one could possibly live so long. Maybe just a distant relative. It really wouldn't be all that impossible. Regardless, this is the story I've gathered off the inception of this little town I live in. I can't help but notice that the dark waters Constant refers to are strikingly similar to the large river that flows only a mile or so outside of town. I have never heard or seen anyone going fishing there, nor swimming in. Either way, I agree with the apprehension around the strange dark water, and I can't help but think that the odd development of our wildlife had something to do with this town's main water source. But speculation is not my strong suit. So for now, I'll leave y'all to decide what these journal entries might be alluding to. They remind me of the whole ordeal around the chronic wasting disease epidemic we had with livestock a while back. Maybe I'll tell that story one day. But for now, I'm just going to head back to my simple little life. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for visiting the King's Crypt. That was part 3, and for now, the final episode of A PSA from My Town by East-Criticism-7844. Please go and give this fantastic story writer some love. He can be found on Reddit. And as always, have a killer day.